When Concetta Fierravanti-Wells launched her takedown of the Prime Minister this week,
an autocrat, a bully who has no moral compass. Morrison is not fit to be Prime Minister.
she wasn't just taking a stand for herself.
Morrison might profess to be Christian, but there was nothing Christian about what was done to Michael Toke.
In 2007, just 2 years after the Cronulla riots, Morrison was running for preselection for the seat of Cook in Sydney's Sutherland Shire, and he was losing to Michael Toke. Despite Toke winning the initial ballot, 82 votes to Morrison's 8, his victory was overturned following a bitter campaign waged against him, allegedly driven by Morrison, who, it's claimed, told other Liberal Party members Toke was being investigated by the party. Morrison went on to win the preselection. Toke dropped out of politics.
It is with humility and a deep sense of appreciation to the electors of Cook that I rise to make my maiden speech in this House.
I'm advised that there are several statutory declarations to attest to racial comments made by Morrison at the time that we can't have a Lebanese person in Cook.
Those stat decks have now emerged, alleging Morrison told key Liberal Party members Toke was rumoured to be a Muslim, even though he's known to be a Catholic. It's claimed the future PM warned of a swing against the Liberals in Cook because of Toke's Lebanese background.
Well, it's untrue.
The PM today put it all down to a smear campaign.
You can make your own assumptions about why people would want to viciously attack me on the eve of an election. I could not reject this more fundamentally, more soundly. And you will hear voices of others who will do exactly the same thing.
He's categorically denied it. And Jamal Rifi, who is one of Australia's leaders of the Australian Muslim Lebanese community, has said about Scott Morrison that he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. That's what he has said.
But the man at the centre of it all doesn't share that view, telling the Sun Herald,
I stand by the declarations I asserted in my statutory declaration. Amongst many unedifying tactics used to unseat me from my pre-selection victory for Morrison, racial vilification was front and centre, and he was directly involved. Racism is divisive, creating hate and hurt, and should have no place in Australian society.
People are going to throw stones. They're going to make accusations. But you've got to look at the motivations. You've got to look at whether people are speaking out of disappointment and, as a result, are making unfounded allegations. They are unfounded because my record speaks for itself.
Karen Middleton is the chief political correspondent for the Saturday paper and broke the story over the weekend. Karen, in various forms, these claims have been floating around for 15 years, so why is it all exploding now?
Well, it's got a fair bit to do with that speech by Concetta Fierravanti-Wells that we just heard a little bit about on Tuesday night. That was a bombshell on budget night. I don't know anyone who knew that that was coming. I certainly didn't know. And she mentioned in that speech these statutory declarations and that they had allegedly made reference to the Lebanese background that Scott Morrison had allegedly made reference to Michael Toke's Lebanese background. Now, I heard about these statutory declarations back in 2018. They had been written about in one newspaper prior to that in 2016 when they were signed, but I hadn't remembered or been aware of them until then. And then in conversations with people, they'd come up. I've been trying off and on for 4 years to find out what was in them and get the details. And I think what happened was when Concetta Fierravanti-Wells put this on the public record this week, and from my point of view, I then picked up the phone on Wednesday and started calling a range of people again to see whether they had changed their minds about assisting. And eventually, and I think these declarations had now sort of got slightly wider circulation than they might have had originally, and I eventually managed to get access to some of the detail from some of those documents.
Karen, the government says this is a case of opponents seeking to attack Scott Morrison on the eve of the election. Is there any truth to that?
Well, look, the political hit job came from his own senator. And I think the kind of irony of that is Senator Fierravanti-Wells had her massive spray in the parliament because she's been done over in her pre-selection. That was a pre-selection that was delayed until just last week. It could have been held a long time ago, and the great irony is if they wanted to get rid of her, which they clearly did, and they have arranged it that she was defeated, they could have done it 6 months ago. I suspect, given how angry she is, she would always have had a spray, but she would have had her spray a long time ago. And I think now the landscape has changed. There's been a little bit of a change of sentiment about the Prime Minister in the last few months, and maybe that's what's inspired these people who have access to these documents, who've been refusing for literally years to talk about them or pass any details on, maybe they felt there's cover with the parliamentary privilege comment, and that now there is a proximity to the election, they've decided to do that. But they have to speak to that. I can't answer that question.
Karen, it's interesting today that in his defence, Scott Morrison used the phrase, "My record speaks for itself." And I wonder whether it's worth reflecting on the fact that Julia Banks called him a bully. He denied that. The French president called him a liar. He denied that. Barnaby Joyce had some pretty choice descriptions for him as well. Again, those characterisations were denied. Is it simply the case that actually the Australian public sees this and maybe doesn't really care?
It's entirely possible that that is true. You know, I've heard the argument in the last few days that it will just cement people's views. If they love Scott Morrison and they believe him, they'll just say this is a hit job and nothing more. If they don't like him, they'll say, well, this just confirms what we think. There have been other people in the last couple of days who've come out and endorsed Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells's view about the bullying, at least. Pauline Hanson and Jackie Lambie said they thought that the same thing. Zali Steggall said she hadn't had personal experience of it, but she had seen the way he operated and she wasn't happy with it. So there have been these sort of peripheral corroborating comments, but you may be right. It may turn out that it just cements people in their views and doesn't change anyone's opinion. I'm sure, though, that the Prime Minister would prefer that this hadn't happened so close to an election. And as I say, it's kind of ironic because Conchetta could have made her angry speech months ago if they got their pre-selections sorted out then.
So close to an election and so close to calling an election as well. Karen Middleton, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
It will be curious to see once the actual election campaign gets underway how much voter appetite there is to revisit these chapters from either the Prime Minister or the opposition leader's history and to go back to events 10, 15 years ago. I'm sure that for some people it will sway a vote because it does speak to character, but I suspect for a large part of the electorate, they want to cast their vote on the assessment of what the leaders are bringing to the election in 2022. What policies are they laying out and what are they saying today rather than in the past?
Will we get to that point? Because at the moment, and maybe it is calling the election that will trigger more policy making than just personal attacks on people, but it's interesting.
Do you think people actually are sort of turned off politics more generally when they hear, oh, he said this in 2007 or Albo said this when he was a young communist back in, student days or whatever it was?
I think that it sort of suggests that we're not living in a culture where we can move on from things, where we can make mistakes, allegedly say potentially very inflammatory, hurtful things, but that we're fixated on that rather than what's happening right before us. I mean, let's be honest, it's not like there's not an awful lot to hold our leaders to account right here and right now. I'm just not sure that a lot of voters need to be going back to the modern history books. Yeah.